Call Kevin Haig.
Mr Speaker, I rise to continue the Green Party's support for this bill. Given this is a second reading debate, I want to begin by thanking the submitters. They were relatively few in number, but their submissions were of pretty high quality. Also thanking the officials who served the committee very well. And I want to express my personal appreciation to the other members of the Select Committee, and especially Jonathan Young, its chair, for enabling me to participate in at least part of the committee's process. Mr Speaker, unlike, I think, the National and Labor parties, the Green Party policy around funding for ACC is that the scheme should be funded as it was originally intended through pay-as-you-go and a moderately sized reserve to be able to deal with fluctuations from year to year. We oppose full funding or future funding, or as I like to call it, full future funding for ACC, a principle which is enshrined in the existing legislation and is also specifically enumerated in this bill as one of the financial responsibility principles. We oppose full future funding because it mimics the way that private insurance works. Now, a private insurance company needs to use full future funding because the person who pays a premium this year and who makes a claim on an insurance policy may not be a policy holder for that insurance company next year, and the liability would nonetheless still exist. So it needs to be able to capture that with full future funding. But that same principle does not apply to ACC, because if one is intent on ensuring that ACC remains a core government service, then the person who pays a levy to ACC this year and who may make a claim will still be a levy payer next year and the year after and the year after that. So the case for needing full future funding simply is not made out in the case of ACC, unless that is the intent of the government is to privatise or at least to open up the scheme to competition from the private sector. And Ian Leese-Galloway has in fact spoken in this debate around that dishonourable history around the ACC scheme. Some of the reasons that we oppose that full future funding, first of all, it actually, because in fact of the uncertainty around valuation of future liabilities that both Jonathan Young and the previous government speaker have spoken about, that uncertainty about the value of future liability leads, in fact, to the kind of volatility in levies that all speakers in the debate so far have said they're interested in trying to control. Now, this bill, contrary to what several speakers in the debate so far have spoken about, is not intended to actually address that volatility. It's about ensuring transparency, which is a different but worthy goal. The other problem with future full funding ACC as if it were a private insurance company, is that then that starts to create some of the behaviour that you might expect to see in a private insurance company. It starts to create what I've called in this House over a number of years now, a culture of disentitlement, where people working on the board of ACC, in its management and at all levels, think that their job is to be able to say no to claims, rather than to honour the social contract on which this great scheme is actually founded. Now, I think, as I say, I think the Greens pretty much alone in the House are advocates of pay-as-you-go funding. So we would, if we had the opportunity, return the scheme to that basis. But actually, since the scheme is now more or less full funded, that debate, for the sake of this bill at least, is largely academic. And for this bill, as we have indicated, and as all of the submitters indicated, the purpose of improving the transparency of the levy setting process for ACC and making sensible adjustments around residual levies is absolutely a sensible thing to do. So, Mr. Speaker, I think both the small number of submissions and the content of the submissions indicate that that most people accept that these are worthy things to try and achieve. I want to talk about two particular things in relation to the detail of the bill. The one is around the process for levy setting. Several submitters commented that the existing process for levy setting involved a process of consultation that was sometimes tokenistic and actually bore little relationship to the results that actually came about in the levy setting process. In other words, a disingenuous process, Mr. Speaker. And that's because of the conflation of both technical and political goals in the levy setting process. And I indeed have expressed some criticism of the government for its use of both the ACC reserve and its levies as a kind of ballast for the government's overall financial position, which I believe to be inappropriate. And I accept the point that Labor speakers have made that that is not properly addressed in this bill, and the bill would be improved if it were properly addressed. And both unions and Business New Zealand would agree with that being done. And if the government is serious about what it said about the purpose of the bill, it too will agree to making that specific and clear. But Mr. Speaker, I thank the Select Committee for picking up my proposal that setting of the funding policy statement should also be the subject of consultation. Because, Mr. Speaker, that is the political part of the process. So separating out the political part from the technical part is important, but the consultation is actually more important about the political settings that levies are based on, rather than the technical side of things, which actually really is not amenable to all that much change. So it's great that that change has been made by the Select Committee. The funding policy statement will then be tabled in Parliament, and I think that's a very useful stage in the process. I want to take that further still and say that once that statement has been tabled in Parliament, it should then be subject to parliamentary debate. And I'm not sure if it's the place for this bill to make that explicit, or whether Parliament needs to express to the Business Committee and future business committees that that is the expectation of Parliament, that there should be debate around that policy statement, but it should certainly occur. I just want to say something briefly around the residual levies process, because the changes that are being made in the bill and actually improved by the Select Committee are sensible ones. But there was also an important submission made by the Council of Trade Unions around occupational disease and the poor basis that exists in legislation and in ACC's processes for setting residual levies or setting levies appropriately to deal with occupational disease. Now, the advice the Select Committee received was that that was outside the scope of this bill, and I guess I have to accept that. But if that is indeed the case, then it now becomes incumbent on government and on this House to create a process where it is appropriate to discuss the ongoing basis for funding occupational disease claims appropriately. And Mr. Speaker, it's certainly my hope that one of the things that can come about as a result of this bill is perhaps a cross-party negotiation so that we can achieve some consensus around the basis for ACC going forward that enables us to discuss those outstanding issues, the culture of disentitlement, the basis on which occupational disease will be dealt with, and potential expansions of the scheme as was originally intended. In other words, Mr. Speaker, creating the basis, creating the platform for us to return to honour that original ACC social contract and return integrity to the scheme. Thank you, sir.
Call Clayton Mitchell.